Richard thought he had me cornered in my own living room, 3 lawyers, 2 witnesses, and a stack of oil lease documents that would make him rich. He called me illiterate. He laughed when I squinted at the fine print. He threatened me with IRS audits for cash transactions I'd supposedly hidden from the government. In front of everyone, he painted me as the backward hillbilly uncle who didn't understand modern business. They all watched me fumble with my reading glasses, heard me mispronounce petroleum, saw me count on my fingers. Richard was so busy performing his superiority, he forgot to ask the one question that mattered: why would a man who can't read own 640 acres of mineral rights? The morning had started clean. I was out in the workshop, the one I built with my own hands back in 1993, replacing the fuel filter on my Chevrolet pickup. The truck was old, a 1987 model with rust eating through the wheel wells and a transmission that coughed when it shifted into third, but it ran. That was all that mattered. I had the hood propped open, my hands black with grease, the smell of motor oil and old gasoline thick in the air. The radio was playing something low and twangy, a steel guitar weeping through a song about loss that I wasn't really listening to. I was focused on the threads of the filter housing, working the wrench slow and steady so I wouldn't strip them. The metal was cold against my palms despite the heat of the day. Outside, the cicadas were screaming in the live oaks, that grinding buzz that meant summer was settling in hard. I heard the car before I saw it. The crunch of tires on gravel, the low purr of an engine that cost more than most people make in a year. I didn't look up right away. Kept working the wrench. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside the open bay door of the shop. I wiped my hands on a rag that used to be a white undershirt, back when Eisenhower was president, and glanced up. A white sedan sat in my driveway, sleek and German, the kind of car that looked like it belonged in a commercial where beautiful people drove along coastal highways at sunset. The paint was so clean it hurt to look at in the sun. Dealer plates still attached. Richard climbed out first. My nephew. My sister's only boy. He was wearing a suit the color of wet concrete, tailored so tight I could see the lines of his body underneath, and shoes that gleamed like they'd been spit-shined by someone he'd paid. His hair was slicked back with something that smelled like chemically enhanced confidence. He smiled at me, but it wasn't the smile of a man visiting family. It was the smile of a salesman who'd already spent his commission. Behind him came 3 more men. 2 were in similar suits, carrying leather cases that looked heavy with paperwork. The third was older, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and an expression that suggested he'd seen every kind of human foolishness and had stopped being surprised by it years ago. They moved across my gravel drive like a small invading army, polished and purposeful, their shoes crunching on the stones I'd laid down by hand in 2004. Richard extended his hand as he approached. I noticed the watch first. Silver and black, the kind you see in magazine ads worn by men on yachts. It caught the sunlight and threw it back in sharp little flashes. I took his hand because that's what you do, even when your gut tells you not to. His grip was firm, performative, the handshake of a man who'd read a book about how to dominate business meetings. Uncle Jeb, he said, and his voice had that smooth quality of someone who'd trained himself to sound important. Good to see you. We need to talk about an opportunity. An opportunity. That's what he called it. He didn't wait for me to invite him inside. Just walked past me, past the truck with its guts hanging out, past the workbench covered in tools I'd owned longer than he'd been alive, and straight toward the house. The 3 men followed him like ducks in a row. I stood there for a moment, the greasy rag still in my hands, watching them disappear through my screen door. The heat pressed down on my neck. My knees ached from squatting by the truck. I could feel something tightening in my chest, not panic, not anger, just a cold awareness that the day had changed shape. I followed them inside. They'd made themselves comfortable in my living room. Richard had spread papers across the coffee table, the one my wife had picked out at an estate sale in 1978. The wood was scarred and water-stained, and now it was covered in crisp white documents with highlighted sections and little colored tabs marking where I was supposed to sign. The 2 lawyers, because that's what they were, I could tell by the way they held themselves, stood flanking Richard like bookends. The older man sat in the armchair that used to be my spot for watching the evening news. Nobody had asked if they could sit. Nobody had asked if I had time. They'd just taken over my space like they owned it. Richard tapped one of the documents with his finger, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Uncle Jeb, This is incredible news. Continental Energy wants to lease your mineral rights. The signing bonus alone is $45,000. He said it like he was handing me a winning lottery ticket. Like I should fall to my knees in gratitude. I moved closer, squinting at the papers. Let my mouth hang open just a little. Scratched the back of my head, slow and confused. The performance I'd been perfecting for 20 years. What's this now? I asked, my voice slow and thick, the accent I'd learned from my father rolling off my tongue like molasses. Oil lease. The lead lawyer, the one in the armchair, leaned forward. His name tag said Jacobson. He had the kind of face that looked expensive, like he moisturized and got regular facials. Mr. Stone, this is a standard mineral rights lease agreement. Continental Energy believes there may be extractable resources beneath your property. They're offering you $45,000 just to sign, plus quarterly royalties if they find anything. But there ain't no oil here, I said, letting my eyes wander across the page like I was trying to read words I didn't understand. My daddy owned this land. His daddy before that. It's dry as a bone. Richard laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was something he manufactured for the audience, sharp and dismissive. Uncle Jeb, you're not a geologist. Continental has satellite imaging, seismic data, computer models. They know what's under your land better than you know what's in your own cellar. He looked at the lawyers when he said it, making sure they saw him handling the simple old men. Making sure they knew he was the sophisticated intermediary who could translate the modern world for his backward relatives. I picked up the document. Held it close to my face. Moved my lips like I was sounding out words. Let my finger trace under a random sentence about subsurface extraction rights and indemnification clauses. This here says something about my house, I muttered. What's it mean? It means nothing about your house, Jacobson said, and I could hear the barely concealed contempt in his voice. You retain all surface rights. They're only leasing what's underground. The minerals. I looked up at Richard. His eyes were bright, eager. He needed this. I could see it in the way his jaw was clenched, in the way he kept glancing at the lawyers like he was afraid they'd leave before the deal closed. I don't trust banks, I said quietly. Don't like signing papers neither. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. Richard's smile thinned at the edges. He exchanged a glance with Jacobson, some kind of silent communication between predators. Then he pulled out his phone, one of those sleek glass rectangles that costs as much as a used car. He tapped the screen a few times, pulled up something, and slid it across the table toward me. Uncle Jeb, here's the thing. The IRS has been asking questions about you. Seems there've been some cash transactions that weren't properly reported. Carpentry work, firewood sales, maybe some under-the-table labor. The words landed like stones in still water. I looked at the phone screen. So official-looking letterhead, tax code citations, legal language designed to terrify. Tax evasion is a federal crime, Richard continued, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. When they audit a man your age, when they start digging into decades of financial records, they always find something. You could lose everything. The house, the land, your pension. Everything. He let that sit for a moment. Let it sink into my bones. Then he smiled again, warm and reassuring. But I can help you, Uncle Jeb. I have connections in the regional IRS office. Friends from college. If you work with me on this lease, I can make those questions disappear. I can protect you. But you need to decide now. The room was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock, the one shaped like a rooster that my wife had loved and I'd never had the heart to take down after she died. I looked at Richard. Looked at the three men in my living room, standing on the rug where my wife and I used to dance on Saturday mornings when the radio played something slow. I felt the weight of the threat pressing against my chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. The mask had slipped. Richard wasn't here as family. He was here as something else. Something hungry. I need time to think on it, I said finally, my voice small and uncertain. Richard's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath his eye. He glanced at his watch, that expensive silver thing, and I saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. You have until Friday, Uncle Jeb. 3 days. After that, I can't help you anymore. The paperwork goes to the investigators, and whatever happens, happens." He stood up, straightening his jacket. The lawyers gathered their portfolios. Jacobson gave me a look that was half pity, half disgust, the way you'd look at a dog too old to learn new tricks. They left the documents on my coffee table like an eviction notice. Richard paused at the door, turning back to look at me one last time. "I'm trying to help you, Uncle Jeb. Don't be stubborn. Don't throw away your only chance because you're too proud to accept reality." Then they were gone. I heard the car doors slam, heard the expensive engine purr to life, heard the gravel crunch as they backed out of my driveway and disappeared down the county road. The dust they kicked up hung in the air for a long time after, golden in the afternoon light, slowly settling back to earth. I stood in the doorway, my hands still stained with grease, and let the silence fill the space they'd left behind. My heart was beating steady and slow. Not racing. Not panicking. Just keeping time. I walked back to the coffee table and looked down at the papers. Picked up the top document and read it, really read it, with the eyes of a man who'd spent 42 years reading geological surveys, mineral rights contracts, and extraction lease agreements. Read it with the comprehension of someone who'd earned a master's degree in petroleum geology from the University of Texas in 1979. Richard had made his first mistake. He'd assumed the mask was the man. And now the clock was ticking. Not for me. For him. After the white sedan disappeared down County Road 12, after the dust settled back onto the gravel and the sound of that expensive engine faded into the cicada buzz, I locked the front door. Not the flimsy push-button lock that came with the house, but the deadbolt I'd installed myself in 2001 after a string of burglaries hit the county. The metal slid home with a solid thunk that I felt in my palm. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the lock, feeling the coolness of the brass against my skin. My chest was tight, not with panic, but with something colder. Calculation. The recognition that a line had been crossed and there was no walking it back. I moved through the house, past the living room where Richard's papers still sat on the coffee table like a contamination, past the kitchen where the morning's coffee had gone cold in the pot, and down the narrow hallway to what anyone else would call the junk room. The door stuck a little when I pushed it, the wood swollen from 40 years of Texas humidity. Inside, the air was cooler, dustier. The room smelled like old paper and the faint ghost of my wife's lavender sachets, the ones she used to tuck into drawers to keep the moths away. She'd been dead 6 years now, but the smell lingered like she'd just stepped out for groceries. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with a single window that looked out onto the back pasture where nothing grew anymore except wiregrass and mesquite. There was a desk against the far wall, a gray metal thing I'd bought at a government surplus auction in 1996. The surface was scratched and dented, covered with the circular ghosts of coffee cups and the grooves of ballpoint pens pressed too hard through too many sheets of paper. Above the desk were shelves, rough pine boards I'd cut and mounted myself, sagging slightly under the weight of 3 decades of accumulated documentation. I pulled the step stool over, the aluminum cold under my hands, and climbed up slow. My knees complained, that deep ache that lived in the joints now, permanent as the Texas heat. I reached for the top shelf, past the box of old tax returns and the manila envelopes stuffed with utility bills, and pulled down the accordion file. It was green, faded to almost gray, with a white label across the front in my own handwriting, Property Taxes 1998 through 2026. The elastic closure had gone brittle years ago, cracked and splitting, but it still held. I carried the file to the desk and sat down in the wooden chair, the same one I'd built when we first moved into this house. The seat was worn smooth, the finish rubbed away by the fabric of my jeans over thousands of hours. I could feel every contour of it against my spine, familiar as my own skeleton. I opened the file. Inside were documents arranged in chronological order, each one protected in a clear plastic sleeve. Not because I was obsessive, but because paper decays. Moisture gets in, ink fades, edges tear. If you're going to keep something, you keep it right. The first document I pulled out was dated August 15, 2004. A geological survey report, 43 pages bound with a black plastic coil. The cover page was simple, subsurface analysis of Section 14, Township 8 North, Range 3 West, Harris County, Texas. Conducted by J. Stone, independent petroleum geologist. My name. My work. I'd spent 3 weeks that summer walking every inch of this property with a geological hammer and a notebook, taking core samples, measuring formations, mapping the subsurface structure. The Barnett Shale formation, the one that had made a lot of men rich in other parts of Texas, didn't extend this far south. The rock here was wrong, too compressed, too metamorphosed. No porosity, no permeability. No oil. No gas. Nothing but stone that had been squeezed by geological pressure for millions of years until it was as useful as concrete. I'd known it then. I knew it now. Continental Energy either hadn't done their homework, or they were gambling on desperation. Mine or someone else's. The second document was dated March 9, 2006. Articles of Incorporation for Clearwater Mineral Holdings, LLC. Registered in Delaware, because Delaware doesn't ask questions and doesn't charge much. The corporation had one member, J. Stone. One purpose, to hold and manage mineral rights. One asset, nothing, at the time of filing. It had cost me $375 to set up, including the registered agent fee. I'd done it online, sitting at this same desk, following instructions from a legal website designed for small business owners. The third document was the one that mattered most. A warranty deed, recorded with the Harris County Clerk's Office on February 15, 2007. The deed transferred all mineral rights, oil, gas, and associated hydrocarbons from Jebediah Stone, individual, to Clearwater Mineral Holdings, LLC, corporate entity. Consideration, $1 and other valuable considerations. I'd driven to the courthouse myself to file it, stood in line for 40 minutes behind a young couple trying to file a marriage license, and handed the clerk a check for $18 to record the deed. She'd stamped it, handed me a receipt, and that was that. The minerals were no longer mine personally. They belonged to the company. A company Richard didn't know existed. I spread the documents across the desk in sequence, like evidence at a trial. Survey. Incorporation. Deed. Then I pulled out the most recent item, dated January 23, 2026. A letter on Continental Energy letterhead, addressed to Clearwater Mineral Holdings, LLC, care of my registered agent in Delaware. The letter offered a seismic testing lease for $12,000, with an option to extend to a full extraction lease if results were promising. I had declined the offer in writing on January 30. Politely, professionally, with no explanation. Continental had moved on, presumably to other prospects. But somewhere between January and now, someone had whispered my name to Richard. Someone had told him that old Jeb Stone, the illiterate hillbilly, owned 640 acres that Continental was sniffing around. Someone had made it sound like I was sitting on a fortune and didn't know it. Richard had done what Richard always did, smelled money and moved fast. He'd contacted Continental directly, presented himself as my representative, my connection to the modern world. He'd probably inflated the numbers, promised he could deliver my signature, and negotiated himself a broker's commission. 30%, if standard rates applied. 30% of $45,000 was $13,500. A number that would matter to a man in debt. A number worth lying for. I sat back in the chair, feeling the wood press against my shoulder blades, and let my eyes drift to the window. Outside, the light was starting to slant golden, late afternoon bleeding into evening. A hawk circled above the pasture, riding thermals I couldn't see, hunting for something small and careless. I thought about Richard. Thought about the boy he'd been, 30 years ago, running through the same pasture with his shoes untied and his shirt untucked, laughing at something only children find funny. His mother, my sister Caroline, had been the opposite of her son. Quiet, careful with money, suspicious of anything that came too easy. She'd raised him alone after her husband walked out, worked 2 jobs to keep him in decent schools, and died when Richard was 23, before she could see what he'd become. A climber. A performer. A man who measured his worth by the price of his watch and the thread count of his suit. I played the role of the simple uncle because it protected me. Let people think you're slow and they don't ask complicated questions. They don't scrutinize your finances, don't wonder why a warehouse manager has a filing system that would make a lawyer proud. They see what they expect to see, an old man in worn jeans and grease-stained shirts, living in a house that needed paint, driving a truck held together by rust and prayer. But the role had a cost. It meant swallowing small indignities. It meant letting people like Richard feel superior, letting them laugh at my mispronunciations and my fumbling with technology. It meant biting my tongue when I wanted to correct them, to show them the degrees I'd earned and the career I'd built before I decided that a quiet life was worth more than a prestigious one. I'd retired from Chevron in 2005, walked away from a six-figure salary in a corner office because the corporate ladder had stopped meaning anything after my wife got sick the first time. We'd wanted simple. We'd wanted slow mornings and vegetable gardens and the kind of peace you can't buy in a city. So I'd played dumb, and the world had left me alone. Until now. Richard had made it personal. He'd come into my home, spread lies across my coffee table, and threatened me with the federal government. He'd used family connection as a weapon, assumed I was too ignorant or too frightened to fight back. He'd crossed the line from annoyance to threat, and threats require responses. I pulled out a yellow legal pad from the desk drawer, the kind with narrow lines and a cardboard backing. Found a pen, black ink, the cheap kind you buy in packs of 12 at the grocery store. Started making notes. Not plans exactly, but inventory. What I knew. What Richard didn't know. What I could prove. Richard didn't know about the Geological Survey. Didn't know about Clearwater Mineral Holdings. Didn't know that I'd already been contacted by Continental and had declined. He was operating on assumption and arrogance, and those were flammable materials. I knew his game because it was obvious: broker the deal, collect the commission, disappear before anyone realized the land was worthless. He'd probably already spent the money in his head, maybe in reality. The car was leased, I'd bet on it. The watch was financed. The suit was purchased with a credit card he couldn't afford to pay off. He needed this deal the way a drowning man needs air. And when desperate men don't get what they need, they make mistakes. My job was to let him make them. Let him dig deeper. Let him commit fraud in writing, in front of witnesses, with documentation that couldn't be explained away. Then I'd show him what his backward uncle actually owned, not ignorance, not weakness, but the paper trail that would bury him. I wrote for 20 minutes, filling 3 pages with names, dates, document numbers. When I was finished, I tore the pages from the pad, folded them once, and tucked them into my shirt pocket. Then I gathered the documents from the desk, slid them back into their plastic sleeves, and returned the accordion file to the top shelf. Everything in its place. Everything preserved. I climbed down from the step stool, my knees protesting again, and walked to the window. The hawk was gone. The pasture was empty except for the long shadows of the mesquite trees stretching toward the east. The air in the room felt different now, lighter somehow, like a pressure valve had been released. I'd spent 20 years playing a role, and it had been useful. But roles are tools, not identities. You pick them up when you need them, and you set them down when the job is done. Richard had made the job something different now. Not protection. Retribution. I thought about my wife, about the way she used to look at me when I came home from work, still wearing the mask of the good old boy I showed the world. She'd smile, that small knowing smile, and say, "Long day of being harmless, Jeb." She'd understood. She'd seen the necessity of it. But she'd also seen the cost, the way it ate at me sometimes, pretending to be less than I was. She used to tell me, "One day someone's going to mistake your kindness for weakness, and that's when they'll learn the difference." That day had come. Richard thought he was hunting easy prey, an old man with no defenses and no options. He'd find out different. I left the junk room, pulling the door closed behind me. The house was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the air conditioner struggling against the heat. I walked back to the living room, to the coffee table covered in Richard's papers. Picked up the top document, the lease agreement with its highlighted sections and little tabs marking where I was supposed to sign. Read it again, slowly, professionally, looking for leverage points. And I found them. Clause 17, leaseholder represents and warrants that they possess clear and unencumbered title to all mineral rights described herein. Richard had promised something he couldn't deliver. Clause 23, any misrepresentation of title shall constitute breach of contract and shall subject the breaching party to damages, legal fees, and punitive costs. Continental had built in protection against exactly what Richard was trying to do. He just hadn't read that far. I set the papers down and looked around my living room. At the furniture my wife had chosen, at the walls we'd painted together, at the life we'd built in this house over 45 years. Richard thought he could take this from me with threats and lies. He thought the mask made me helpless. He was wrong. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water from the tap, and drank it standing by the sink. The water was cold, mineral heavy, pumped from the aquifer 100 feet below the house. It tasted like earth and iron, like this land, like something that couldn't be moved or stolen or signed away by men who didn't understand what they were touching. 3 days until Friday. 3 days for Richard to dig his own grave deeper. Then I'd show him what happened when you mistake patience for weakness. When you mistake silence for surrender. I finished the water, rinsed the glass, and set it in the dish rack. Outside, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The hawks would be returning to their roosts soon. The cicadas would quiet down. Night would come, and with it, the coolness that made Texas summers survivable. I had work to do. Phone calls to make. Documents to prepare. But first, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the light die on the land that was mine, really mine, in ways Richard would never understand. And I started the clock. Wednesday morning I called Richard from the landline in the kitchen, the beige rotary phone that had been mounted on the wall since 1974, its coiled cord stretched and kinked from decades of use. My finger fit into the dial holes the way it always had, muscle memory older than Richard's entire life, and I spun the numbers slow, listening to the mechanical clicking as the dial returned to position after each digit. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up, and I could hear traffic in the background, the whoosh of cars passing, the distant honk of someone impatient. He was probably in his car, probably driving somewhere important in his own mind. "Uncle Jeb," he said, and I could hear the forced brightness in his voice, the salesman's tone he put on like a uniform. "Have you made a decision?" I let silence sit on the line for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Let him hear my breathing, slow and uncertain. "I'll sign," I said finally, and my voice came out shaky, defeated, exactly the way a frightened old man would sound. "But I got conditions." There was a pause on his end, and I could almost see him straightening in his seat, his hand gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Conditions," he repeated, careful now, testing the word. "What kind of conditions?" "I need protection," I said. "Legal protection. In case this all goes wrong somehow. In case them IRS people come after me anyway." Richard's exhale was relief made audible. "Uncle Jeb, that's not how it works. Once you sign, you're protected. I got the connections, remember. Just need something in writing," I pressed, my voice getting smaller, more insistent. "Something that says you checked everything proper like. That you made sure it's all legal." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him thinking, calculating whether this was worth the hassle. Then, "Fine. I can do that. We'll draw something up. I'll bring it tomorrow." Thursday afternoon he came back, and this time the invasion was larger. The same white sedan pulled into my drive at 2:17 in the afternoon, but when the doors opened, 5 men emerged instead of 3. Richard and his 2 lawyers, Jacobson and the younger one whose name I'd never caught, plus 2 new faces. These were Richard's business partners, he explained as they filed into my living room like a corporate parade. Marcus and Derek, investors in the deal, here to witness the signing and ensure everything was above board. Marcus was silver-haired and soft around the middle, wearing a watch that probably cost more than my truck and a cologne that arrived in the room 3 seconds before he did, something expensive and aggressive that made my sinuses ache. Derek was younger, thick in the shoulders and neck, the kind of man who'd played football in high school and never stopped mentioning it. He had a phone in his hand, one of those big expensive rectangles, and he was recording, the little red light blinking like a warning. For documentation purposes, Richard explained, gesturing toward Derek's phone. Everything transparent, everything legal. They arranged themselves around my living room like a tribunal, and I played my part. Shuffled in from the kitchen wearing my stained work shirt and my oldest jeans, the ones with the blown-out knee, carrying a glass of sweet tea that left a wet ring on the coffee table when I set it down. Richard had papers ready, spread across the same scarred wood surface where he'd laid his ambush 2 days before. But this time I had my own document, a single sheet I'd printed at the FedEx office in town, the ink still smelling faintly chemical and new. I slid it across the table toward him, my hand shaking just enough to sell the fear. "What's this, Uncle Jeb?" Richard asked, picking it up, his eyes scanning the text. "Just what I said on the phone," I explained, my words coming slow like I was pulling them from deep water. "Protection. Says you're representing me proper. Says you checked all the ownership papers and such." His eyes moved across the page, fast, too fast. The way a man reads when he's already decided something doesn't matter. The document was simple, boilerplate language I'd pulled from a legal template website, dressed up with official-sounding phrases. "Broker representation agreement," it said across the top in bold letters. The meat of it was buried in paragraph 3. Broker acknowledges conducting comprehensive due diligence on all mineral title records associated with the property described as Section 14, Township 8 North, Range 3 West, Harris County, Texas, and warrants that no conflicting ownership claims, encumbrances, or prior assignments exist that would impair the validity of this transaction. It was a trap disguised as reassurance, and Richard walked right into it. "This is fine," he said, barely finishing the sentence before he pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, one of those heavy metal ones that businessmen carry to feel important. He signed his name across the bottom line with a flourish, the ink dark and permanent against the white paper. Marcus and Derek leaned in, witnesses to the moment, and Richard gestured for them to add their signatures as well. Marcus signed first, his handwriting small and crabbed, the signature of a man who signed a lot of documents and didn't waste time on flourishes. Derek signed second, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore through the paper, then he printed his name underneath in block letters, adding his driver's license number without being asked. Official. Recorded. Irreversible. The notary, a different woman this time, younger than the first, wearing too much makeup that was starting to cake in the creases of her smile, pulled out her stamp and pressed it into the paper with a solid chunk of sound. "Notarized on this day," she said in a bored voice, filling in the date, June 4th, 2026, filling in the county, Harris, and signing her own name with the kind of loops and swirls that people use when they've signed their name 10,000 times and stopped thinking about it. Richard slid the document back to me like he'd just handed me a life preserver. "There, Uncle Jeb. You're protected. Now let's finish this." He pushed the Continental Energy lease across the table, a thick stack of papers with colored tabs sticking out marking signature lines, initials required, dates to fill in. The highlighter yellow screamed from the pages. I picked up the pen Richard had set down, a cheap ballpoint this time, the kind with the company logo printed on the side. I held it over the signature line, and my hand started to shake, not a performance now but something real, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on my chest like a physical thing. I looked up at Richard, and his face arranged in an expression of patient encouragement, and I saw it, just for a second, the flash of something underneath. Not concern. Not family. Just hunger. Raw and unfiltered. The need for this deal to close so he could pay whoever he owed, buy himself another month of looking successful. I set the pen down. "Can't read this part," I said, pointing to a random paragraph in the middle of page 4. "What's it say about drilling on my property? What's it say about my house?" Jacobson leaned forward, and I could see his jaw tighten, that muscle jumping under the skin the way it does when someone's fighting to stay professional. "Mr. Stone, we've been through this. The lease only covers subsurface rights. Your house, your surface land, all of that remains yours. They can't drill through your living room." "But what if they want to?" I insisted, my voice rising slightly, that edge of panic that old people get when they're confused and scared. "What if they say they got to?" "They won't," Richard said, and his voice had lost some of its warmth now, the patience wearing thin. "Uncle Jeb, we don't have all day. Continental needs this signed by Friday or the offer expires. You need this signed because you already spent your commission," I thought but didn't say. Instead I picked up the lease and held it close to my face, squinting at the words, moving my lips like I was sounding them out. Let the silence stretch. Let them watch me struggle. Let Richard's anxiety build. Marcus checked his watch, one of those complicated ones with multiple dials that I'd bet money he didn't actually know how to read. Derek shifted his weight, the floorboard creaking under him. The notary examined her fingernails. Richard's phone buzzed on the table, vibrating against the wood, and he glanced at it, his expression tightening. He didn't answer it. "Can't sign today," I said finally, setting the papers down. "Need my lawyer to look at it first." Richard's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: confusion, anger, and then a forced calm that looked like it cost him physical pain to maintain. "Your lawyer," he repeated, the words coming out flat. "Since when do you have a lawyer, Uncle Jeb?" "Got one now," I said. "Hired him Monday. Young fella out of Austin, specializes in mineral rights and oil leases. Figured I should have someone who understands this stuff better than I do." The room went cold. Not temperature cold, but the kind of cold that happens when something breaks that can't be fixed. Richard stood up slowly, and I watched his hands curl into fists at his sides, watched him force them to unclench. "Uncle Jeb," he said, his voice tight as wire. "We had a deal. We had an understanding. You said you'd sign today." "Said I'd think about signing," I corrected, my voice mild as milk. "Said I had conditions." "Lawyer's a condition. He'll look it over, make sure everything's proper, and then we'll talk." Richard looked at Jacobson, at Marcus, at Derek with his phone still recording everything. Looked back at me. "How long?" he asked. "How long does your lawyer need?" "Week maybe," I said. "Maybe 2. He's a busy fella." Richard's phone buzzed again, dancing across the table, and this time I saw the name on the screen before he grabbed it and shoved it in his pocket. Marcus G. Not Marcus the investor standing in my living room. Someone else. Someone calling on a Wednesday afternoon with the kind of persistence that meant money was involved. "We're done here," Richard said abruptly, gathering up the papers, shoving them into his leather portfolio with hands that weren't quite steady. "Uncle Jeb, you just made a very big mistake." He walked out without another word, and his entourage followed, Marcus shaking his head, Derek still filming, the notary looking confused about whether she'd be paid for a signing that didn't happen. Jacobson paused at the door, looking back at me with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "Your nephew's trying to help you," he said. "I hope you realize that before it's too late." Then he was gone too, and I was alone in my living room with the sound of car doors slamming and an engine starting and gravel crunching under expensive tires. I walked to the window and watched them leave, watched the white sedan disappear down the county road trailing dust like a contrail. Then I picked up the broker representation agreement from the coffee table, the one Richard had signed without reading carefully, the one that now legally bound him to a claim he couldn't fulfill. I folded it in half, then in half again, and slid it into the accordion file where it would wait with all the other documents, all the other proof. Friday morning Richard came back, and this time he came alone. No lawyers, no investors, no witnesses. Just him and his rage, barely contained in a human shape. I was on the front porch when he pulled up, sitting in the wooden rocker I'd built in 1998, drinking coffee from a mug that said "World's Best Grandpa" even though I'd never had kids. The morning was already hot, the sun climbing fast, the air thick enough to chew. Richard slammed the car door hard enough that I heard something rattle inside the panel. He crossed the yard in long strides, his shoes kicking up dust, and he didn't stop at the porch steps. He came right up to where I was sitting, looming over me, his shadow falling across my face. "You're playing games, old man," he said, and his voice was different now, stripped of all pretense, all the corporate smoothness. This was the real Richard, the one underneath the suit. "I have investors who fronted me money based on your commitment. Based on your word." "Never gave my word," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "Just said I'd think about it." "You signed my broker agreement," he snapped. "You acknowledged the deal." "I signed a paper saying you'd do your due diligence on title," I corrected. "Did you do the diligence?" His jaw worked, grinding teeth. "Here's what's happening," he said, and his voice dropped lower, colder, the tone of a man who decided diplomacy was over. "You're signing that lease today, right now, or I'm making the call to the IRS. Not a threat, Uncle Jeb. A promise. By Monday you'll have federal auditors crawling through every dollar you've touched since you were born. They'll find something. They always do. And you'll spend whatever years you have left in courtrooms and maybe prison. I'll make sure of it." He pulled out his phone, held it up so I could see the screen, the contacts app open to a name, Pete Morrison, IRS Criminal Investigation Division. "College buddy," Richard said. "One call, Uncle Jeb. One call and your life is over." Behind him, I saw Derek getting out of a second car I hadn't noticed, a gray sedan parked behind Richard's, and he had his phone out again, filming, the camera pointed at the porch. Insurance. Leverage. Proof that Richard had made the threat, had given the ultimatum, had done everything I needed him to do. "So what's it gonna be?" Richard demanded. "You signing, or am I dialing?" I looked at him, really looked at him, saw the sweat on his forehead despite the early hour, saw the tremor in his hand holding the phone, saw the desperation that had pushed him past caution into open extortion. "Make your call," I said quietly. Richard blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "What?" "Call your friend," I said. "Report me." "Go ahead." He stared at me like I'd started speaking in tongues. "You think I'm bluffing? You think I won't do it?" "I think you'll do whatever you think you have to do," I said. "So do it." For 3 seconds he hesitated, the phone in his hand, his finger hovering over the screen. Then something shifted in his face, some final restraint breaking, and he tapped the screen. "Put it on speaker." The phone rang twice before a voice answered, professional and clipped. "Agent Morrison, CID. Pete, it's Richard Stone. Remember that case I mentioned? The elderly tax evader in Harris County. Jebediah Stone, 640 acres, multiple unreported cash transactions. I have documentation of income he never declared, labor he never reported. We need to move on this." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of typing. "Send me what you have," Morrison said. "We'll open a preliminary inquiry." Richard ended the call and looked at me with something like triumph mixed with disgust. "It's done," he said. "Enjoy your audit, Uncle Jeb. When the government seizes this property at auction, I'll be there to buy it. Pennies on the dollar." He turned and walked back to his car, Derek following with his phone still raised, still recording. They left together, 2 cars pulling out of my driveway, leaving me alone on the porch with my coffee going cold in my hand. I sat there for 5 minutes, listening to the silence, feeling the heat build against my skin. Then I stood up, went inside, and made my own phone call. Not to a lawyer in Austin. I didn't have one of those. But to someone else. Someone who'd been waiting for me to give the signal. Someone who understood that chess wasn't won by moving first, but by letting your opponent commit to moves they couldn't take back. The phone rang once before he answered. "It's time," I said. And just like that, the trap was ready to spring. Monday arrived hot and breathless, the kind of Texas morning where the air sat on your chest like a living thing and the sun hadn't even cleared the horizon yet. I was in the kitchen making eggs when I heard the vehicles, plural, the sound of multiple engines rumbling up my gravel drive. Not one car this time. 3. I turned off the stove burner, left the eggs congealing in the cast iron pan, and walked to the front window. What I saw made my stomach tighten, not with fear but with recognition that the situation had escalated past negotiation into something uglier. Richard's white sedan was in the lead, but behind it came a silver pickup truck I didn't recognize and a van, one of those commercial types with no windows in the back, white and anonymous. The vehicles parked in a line across my front yard, not on the gravel drive where they belonged but right on the grass, tires cutting dark scars into the lawn I'd spent 30 years maintaining. Doors opened and people emerged. Richard first, wearing the same gray suit but rumpled now, slept in maybe, the tie loosened and the collar unbuttoned. Behind him came Marcus and Derek, the investors, both wearing expressions that suggested they'd been up all night arguing about money. From the pickup came 2 men I'd never seen before, younger, early 30s maybe, wearing work clothes and tool belts, the kind of men you hire when you need something moved or broken. And from the van came a woman, blonde and sharp-featured, wearing real estate clothes, a blazer and skirt that were trying too hard to look professional. She carried a clipboard and a camera, one of those expensive digital ones that real estate agents use to make hovels look like palaces. Richard saw me in the window and smiled, but it wasn't a smile anymore. It was a baring of teeth. He gestured for the group to follow and they came up the porch steps like an occupying force, not bothering to knock, just opening my front door like they owned it. I met them in the living room, standing in front of the coffee table, my hands loose at my sides. "Morning, Richard," I said, keeping my voice level. "Didn't know we had an appointment." "We don't," Richard said, and his voice had that manic edge of someone running on caffeine and desperation and the belief that momentum could substitute for planning. "But we're here anyway, Uncle Jeb, because you've left me no choice. This is Patricia, he said, gesturing to the real estate woman. She's going to photograph and list this property. We're selling it. Today. Cash offers only. My heart rate didn't change. Stayed steady, that same rhythm it had maintained since this whole situation started. You can't sell my house, Richard. It's not yours to sell. He pulled papers from his jacket pocket, unfolded them, thrust them toward me. Power of attorney, he said. I had Solomon Gold draw these up. You're clearly incapacitated, clearly unable to manage your own affairs. Between the tax issues and your obvious cognitive decline, a case can be made that you need a conservator. That's me. I'm taking over your finances, your property, all of it. For your own good. The papers looked official, covered in legal language and signature lines, but they were blank. Unsigned. Unauthorized. Props in a performance. These aren't valid, I said quietly. They're not signed by me or witnessed or notarized or anything else that would make them legal. They will be, Richard said, and something in his tone made the room feel smaller. By end of day, you'll sign them. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is I make another call, not to the IRS this time, but to Adult Protective Services. Tell them I'm concerned about my elderly uncle living alone, showing signs of dementia, making poor decisions. They'll come evaluate you, Uncle Jeb. They'll ask you questions. And when you can't answer them right, when you fumble and forget things because that's what you always do, they'll recommend a facility. A nice safe place where people can watch you 24 hours a day. Make sure you don't hurt yourself. He let that sit in the air between us, the threat clear and ugly. Patricia, start with the exterior, he said without looking away from me. Get photos of the property, the outbuildings, everything. We'll list it at $200,000, should move fast at that price. Patricia hesitated, looking between Richard and me. Mr. Stone, she said, uncertainty creeping into her professional voice. If there's a dispute about ownership, I can't legally list the property. We need clear title. There's no dispute, Richard snapped. He's my uncle, he's incapacitated, and I have power of attorney. That's clear enough. Now do your job or I'll find someone who will. She swallowed, nodded, and headed for the door, camera in hand. Marcus and Derek stood near the entrance, blocking it, their presence a physical statement that I wasn't leaving. The two workers, the ones from the pickup, started walking through my house like they were taking inventory, opening closets, looking in rooms, one of them making notes on a phone. Richard pulled out his own phone and made a call, not bothering to move away or lower his voice. Solomon, it's Richard Stone. I need you at the Harris County property. Now. We're executing the conservatorship paperwork and I need it notarized immediately. Yes, I know it's Monday morning. I'm paying you enough to make house calls. Be here in an hour. He ended the call and looked at me with something that might have been pity if it wasn't so thoroughly mixed with contempt. You could have just signed the lease, Uncle Jeb. Could have taken the $45,000 and lived comfortable for your last few years. But you had to be stubborn. Had to pretend you were smarter than you are. So now we do it the hard way. Through the window I could see Patricia photographing the front of the house, the peeling paint on the shutters, the roof that needed shingles replaced, the porch that sagged slightly on the south side. She was documenting poverty, building a case that the property was a teardown, worth buying only for the land. One of the workers came back from the bedrooms. Lot of old stuff in there, he said to Richard. You want us to start clearing it out? Bring in the dumpster. Not yet, Richard said. Wait until he signs. But get the truck ready. I want to be able to move fast once this is done. The men nodded and headed back outside. I could hear him on his phone, calling someone, arranging for waste removal, for a dumpster to be delivered, for my life to be erased one truckload at a time. Derek had his phone out again, filming, documenting everything. Richard's insurance policy, proof that he'd followed proper procedure, that he'd acted in my best interest, that any resistance I showed was just evidence of the incapacity he was claiming. I stood in the center of my living room, surrounded by invaders, and felt the weight of the moment pressing down. This was the point. This was where Richard had committed so thoroughly that he couldn't back out, couldn't claim it was a misunderstanding or a negotiation gone wrong. He brought witnesses. He'd brought workers. He'd called a notary and a real estate agent. He'd documented his intentions in front of multiple third parties with cameras recording. He'd crossed every line there was to cross, and he'd done it in broad daylight, confident that I had no recourse, no defense, no power to stop him. He'd made the fatal error of believing his own performance. Patricia came back inside, her camera full of images. "I got the exterior and the outbuildings," she said to Richard. "Do you want interior shots too? Might help with the listing." "Yes," Richard said. "Every room. Show the condition, show why it needs work. Make it clear this is a fixer-upper, price accordingly." She moved through the house, the click and whir of her camera a strange punctuation to the violation happening around me. She photographed the kitchen with its old appliances, the living room with its worn furniture, the hallway with its family photos that she didn't look at, just documented as clutter. Each click was a small theft, taking pieces of my life and converting them into data for strangers to judge. Richard's phone rang and he answered immediately. "You're here? Good. Come on in." The door opened again and a man entered, 50-something, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent. This was Solomon Gold, apparently, the notary or lawyer or whatever Richard had hired to legitimize this circus. "Mr. Stone," Gold said, addressing Richard, not me. "I have the documents prepared. We'll need his signature here, here, and here, plus 2 witnesses who aren't beneficiaries." "Marcus and Derek can witness," Richard said. "They're investors, not family." Gold nodded, setting his briefcase on my coffee table, the same table where this whole nightmare had started a week ago. He pulled out documents, arranged them in neat stacks, uncapped a pen. "Mr. Stone," he said, finally acknowledging my existence. "Your nephew has petitioned for emergency conservatorship based on concerns about your ability to manage your affairs. These documents transfer financial and medical decision-making authority to him, effective immediately upon signing. If you refuse to sign, he'll file with the county court and pursue involuntary conservatorship, which will involve medical evaluations, competency hearings, and likely result in the same outcome but with additional legal costs and stress. I recommend you sign." I looked at the papers, at the pen, at the faces surrounding me. Richard with his desperate triumph. Marcus and Derek with their investor calculations. Gold with his professional detachment. Patricia hovering near the door with her camera. The workers outside waiting to empty my house into a dumpster. This was the tableau Richard had constructed, the moment of maximum pressure, the scene designed to break me. I picked up the pen. Richard's expression shifted to relief so profound it looked like pain releasing. "Finally," he breathed. "Finally you're being reasonable." I held the pen over the signature line. Let my hand hover there. Let them all watch, let them all believe for just a moment that they'd won. Then I set the pen down. Walked to the landline phone on the wall. Picked up the receiver. Richard's face went from relief to confusion to anger in the space between heartbeats. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Making a call," I said, and started dialing, my finger finding the holes in the rotary dial by memory, by muscle knowledge older than Richard's schemes. "Who are you calling?" Richard asked, his voice rising. "Your lawyer can't stop this. This is happening." "Not calling a lawyer," I said. The phone rang once on the other end, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered, professional and familiar. "Harris County Sheriff's Office, Deputy Chin speaking." "My name is Jebediah Stone," I said, my voice clear and steady and completely free of the hillbilly drawl I'd been using for 20 years. "I'm at 640 County Road 12. I need to report a home invasion, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. I have multiple trespassers on my property who are refusing to leave and attempting to coerce me into signing fraudulent legal documents. I need officers dispatched immediately." The room went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Patricia's camera slipping from her hand and hitting the floor. Richard's face had gone white, all the blood draining away like someone had pulled a plug. "What are you doing?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "What I should have done the moment you threatened me," I said. Deputy Chen's voice came through the receiver, calm and procedural. "Units are being dispatched to your location now, Mr. Stone. Can you confirm the number of individuals on your property?" 7, I said. 3 of them have been attempting to extort me for the past week. All of it documented. All of it. Recorded. I have evidence. Richard, you need to stop this, his voice finding volume again, panic sharpening every syllable. You're making a mistake. These are legal proceedings. You're interfering with legal proceedings. There are no legal proceedings, I said, still holding the phone, still speaking to Deputy Chen. There's a fraudulent power of attorney, and signed and invalid. There's a real estate agent photographing property she has no authorization to list. There's hired labor preparing to remove my possessions without my consent. And there's my nephew, who's been threatening me with false IRS reports and involuntary commitments if I don't sign over my property. Gold snapped his briefcase shut, his professional composure cracking. Richard, I was told this was a voluntary conservatorship. If he's calling the sheriff, if there's any question of coercion, I'm not notarizing anything. I'm leaving. He headed for the door, moving fast, a man who knew when a situation had gone toxic. Patricia was right behind him, abandoning her camera, her clipboard, her commission. Richard grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the muscle, his face inches from mine. You're senile, he hissed. You don't know what you're doing. You're confused. I'll tell them you're confused. I looked at his hand on my arm, then at his face. My voice when I spoke was quiet, cold, the voice of someone who'd run out of patience for performance. I'm not senile, Richard. I'm a retired petroleum geologist with a master's degree from the University of Texas. I know exactly what I'm doing. And what I'm doing is watching you destroy yourself. His grip loosened, his hand falling away like he'd touched something burning. In the distance, growing louder, I could hear sirens. The Continental Energy regional office occupied the 8th floor of a glass tower in the Galleria district, the kind of building that reflected the Houston sky back at itself in panels of mirror blue that made you squint to look at it. The lobby was all polished granite and recessed lighting, cold air pumping through vents that hummed like distant machinery, and a security desk where a man in a uniform too tight across the shoulders checked IDs and handed out visitor badges on lanyards that felt like leashes. I arrived at 9:47 on Monday morning, exactly 13 minutes before the meeting Richard had scheduled, the meeting he'd arranged with Continental's Landman division and his investors to finalize what he thought was the deal that would save his collapsing financial life. I was wearing my cleanest flannel shirt, red and black check, the one I saved for funerals and court appearances, and my 1998 Wranglers that had been washed so many times the denim had gone soft and pale. My boots were old, the leather cracked across the toes, and they made solid sounds against the granite as I crossed the lobby. The security guard looked at me like I'd wandered in from a farm auction, which was exactly the impression I wanted to maintain for another 10 minutes, just long enough to get upstairs, just long enough to walk into that conference room and detonate the lie Richard had been building. He checked my driver's license, squinting at the photo like he was comparing it to a wanted poster, then typed something into his computer with 2 fingers, hunting and pecking. You're expected, he said finally, surprised maybe that someone like me had legitimate business in a building like this. 8th floor, conference room B. Take the elevators on the right. I thanked him and took the visitor badge, the plastic rectangle with Guest J Stone printed in sans serif font, and clipped it to my shirt pocket. The elevator was empty, all mirrors and brass railings, and I watched my reflection multiply as the car rose, 8 floors of upward momentum, my stomach dropping slightly as we climbed. The doors opened onto a hallway carpeted in industrial blue, walls lined with photographs of oil derricks and pipeline infrastructure, the visual language of an industry built on extraction and pressure and knowing what's valuable underneath surfaces that look empty. Conference room B was at the end of the hall, the door half open, and I could hear Richard's voice before I saw him, that smooth corporate cadence he used when he was performing confidence. The geological surveys confirm significant potential in the Barnett Shale extension, he was saying. We're looking at a minimum 10-year productive lease, conservative estimates put royalties in the 6-figure range annually. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was large, dominated by a conference table that could seat 20 but currently held 12, floor-to-ceiling windows on the far wall offering a view of Houston sprawling away in all directions, glass and concrete and heat shimmer. Richard stood at the head of the table, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, pointing at a map projected on the wall screen, my property outlined in red like a target. He saw me and his expression shifted, confusion flickering across his face before he rearranged it into something that looked like welcome but felt like panic barely contained. Uncle Jeb, he said, too loud, too bright. Perfect timing. We were just reviewing the geological data. Come in, have a seat. The others turned to look at me. Continental's landman team, 3 of them, 2 men in their 40s and a woman named Patricia Oakes according to the nameplate in front of her chair, all wearing expressions of polite professional interest. Richard's investors, Marcus and Derek, both looking more haggard than they had a week ago, stress written in the shadows under their eyes and the way Derek's leg bounced under the table, a nervous tremor he couldn't control. 2 additional men I didn't recognize. Probably Continental's legal team, watching everything with the flat effect of people paid to notice details. I remained standing near the door, my canvas bag hanging from my shoulder, the same freebie from the 2003 Houston Livestock Show, faded and stained and completely out of place in this room of leather portfolios and titanium briefcases. Before we proceed, I said, and my voice came out different than it had for the past week, different than it had for the past 20 years, clear and steady and stripped of any accent or uncertainty, there's something everyone in this room needs to know. Richard's smile faltered at the edges. Uncle Jeb, why don't you sit down and we can discuss any concerns you have after we finish the presentation? I'm not sitting down, I said. And we're not finishing the presentation. Because the presentation is based on a lie. The room went quiet, that sudden absence of sound that happens when a system glitches, when something that was supposed to run smoothly hits an obstacle it wasn't designed for. Richard's face arranged itself into concern, into patience stretched thin. Uncle Jeb, I know this is overwhelming. These are complicated business matters. Maybe it would be better if you waited outside and let the adults handle the details. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the envelope, legal-sized, manila, the kind you can buy at any office supply store for a few dollars. Inside were documents I'd had prepared 3 weeks ago, after the first inquiry from Continental had arrived at my registered agent's address in Delaware, after I declined their initial offer and started wondering who else might come sniffing around my property with bad information and worse intentions. I walked to the conference table, my boots silent now on the carpet, and handed the envelope to Patricia Oakes. She had the look of someone who'd been doing mineral rights negotiations long enough to smell trouble before it fully materialized, and her expression as she took the envelope was careful, neutral, professional. This is a certified deed, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room, from the Harris County Clerk's office, recorded February 15, 2007. It shows the transfer of all mineral rights on property described as Section 14, Township 8 North, Range 3 West, that's my 640 acres, from Jebediah Stone, individual, to Clearwater Mineral Holdings, Limited Liability Company. Patricia opened the envelope, slid out the document, her eyes moving across the text, the legal descriptions, the recording stamps, the certification from the county clerk. Her expression didn't change but something shifted in her posture, a tension that signaled recognition. I am the sole owner and operator of Clearwater Mineral Holdings, I continued. Which means, Richard, you've been trying to broker a lease on mineral rights you don't own, that I don't personally own, and that your company, I looked at Patricia, already contacted and received a declination from. 6 weeks ago. Your company offered Clearwater Mineral Holdings a seismic testing lease for $12,000. I declined in writing. You have the correspondence in your files. Patricia nodded slowly, her eyes still on the deed. We do, she confirmed. We received a declination letter dated January 30th from Clearwater Mineral Holdings. We moved on to other prospects. Richard was standing very still now, the color draining from his face in a way that reminded me of watching water leave a sink, that inevitable spiral downward. That's, he started, his voice catching, then starting again, that's not possible. You can't read. You're illiterate. You told me you were illiterate. No, I said, and I let the word sit in the air for a moment before continuing. I let you believe I was illiterate. There's a difference. I'm a petroleum geologist, Richard. Retired from Chevron in 2005 after 42 years in the industry. I have a master's degree from the University of Texas, class of 1979. I surveyed this land myself in 2004 and determined it's non-productive. The Barnett Shale formation doesn't extend to this region, the rock structure is wrong, there's no porosity, no permeability, no hydrocarbons. The land is worthless for extraction. Patricia was nodding again, pulling out her own tablet now, swiping through screens. Our initial assessment offered $12,000 for testing rights specifically because the geological indicators were marginal at best, she said, her voice taking on an edge. The higher figure, the $45,000, that came from Mr. Stone, she gestured at Richard, who presented himself as the property owner's representative and assured us the owner was ready to sign. One of Continental's lawyers leaned forward. Are you saying Mr. Richard Stone misrepresented his authority to negotiate this lease? I'm saying he had no authority at all, I said. The minerals aren't mine to lease personally. They belong to a corporate entity he didn't know existed. He inflated your offer to make his commission look more attractive to his investors, and he's been threatening and extorting me for the past week trying to force a signature on a lease that was invalid from the beginning. I reached into my bag again, pulled out the second document, the broker representation agreement Richard had signed Thursday afternoon in my living room, witnessed by Marcus and Derek, notarized by a woman who probably wished she'd called in sick that day. This is an agreement Richard signed 4 days ago, I said, handing it to Patricia. Paragraph 3. He acknowledges conducting comprehensive due diligence on all mineral title records and warrants that no conflicting ownership claims exist. He signed it without checking. He committed fraud in writing, in front of witnesses. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping back, his face gone red in a way that suggested blood pressure medication wasn't working as well as it should. You told us this was locked, he said to Richard, his voice shaking with the kind of rage that comes from realizing you've been lied to by someone you trusted with money. You said the old man was signing. You said it was guaranteed. We fronted you $80,000 based on your representations. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I can explain, he said, but the words came out wrong, too quiet, too uncertain. This is a misunderstanding. Uncle Jeb, we can work this out. No, I said, and the word had weight behind it, finality. We can't. You threatened me with IRS investigations. You attempted to force a fraudulent conservatorship. You brought workers to my home to prepare to empty it. You've committed extortion, fraud, and attempted elder abuse. All of it documented. All of it witnessed. I've already filed complaints with the Texas Real Estate Commission and the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Derek, who'd been filming everything on his phone a week ago, now looked like he wanted to sink through the floor and disappear into the building's foundation. One of Continental's lawyers stood up, gathering papers. We're done here, he said to Patricia. Notify legal to prepare a fraud complaint against Richard Stone. Any agreements he signed as broker are void. We'll be seeking damages for time wasted and misrepresentation. Patricia was already typing on her tablet, sending messages, initiating whatever corporate machinery Continental used to protect itself from liability. I need everyone to understand, I said, looking around the table at faces ranging from shocked to angry to carefully blank, that every interaction I've had with Richard for the past 2 weeks has been documented. Every threat, every false promise, every act of coercion. I have recordings. I have witnesses. I have a paper trail that will bury him. And one more thing. I looked directly at Richard, who was now sitting down, or maybe collapsing, his body folding into the chair like someone had cut his strings. That IRS agent you called, Morrison, I spoke to him Saturday morning. Explained that you were filing false reports against me to extort property. Sent him copies of my tax returns for the past 10 years, all filed properly, all legitimate, all clean. He's now opened an investigation into you for misuse of federal resources, filing false statements to law enforcement, and attempting to weaponize government agencies for personal gain. That's a federal crime, Richard. Richard's hands were on the table in front of him, fingers spread like he was trying to hold onto something solid, and I could see them shaking, a tremor that started in his fingertips and worked up through his wrists. This isn't happening, he said, the words barely audible. This can't be happening. It's already happened, I said. You made it happen. You came into my home, threatened my security, tried to steal my property, and you did it all because you assumed I was too ignorant and too frightened to fight back. You mistook 20 years of strategic camouflage for actual weakness. You thought the mask was the man. Marcus had his phone out now, dialing, holding it to his ear. I need to speak to my attorney, he was saying to someone on the other end. I need to discuss immediate recovery options for fraudulent investment losses. Yes, this is urgent. Derek had his head in his hands, and I could hear him breathing, fast and shallow, the sound of someone realizing that money they'd counted on was gone and wasn't coming back. Patricia Oak stood up, extending her hand to me across the table. "Mr. Stone, I apologize on behalf of Continental Energy for any distress this situation has caused. For what it's worth, your geological assessment of the property aligns with our internal analysis. The land isn't productive. We were skeptical of the higher valuation from the beginning." I shook her hand, felt the firm professional grip of someone who dealt with liars and chancers as a regular part of business and had learned to spot them quickly. "Thank you," I said. Continental's lawyers were packing up, conversations happening in low tones about liability and distance and making sure the company's name stayed clear of whatever legal nightmare was about to consume Richard. Marcus and Derek were at the door, leaving without looking back, leaving Richard sitting alone at the conference table in a room that had gone from triumph to catastrophe in less than 15 minutes. I picked up my canvas bag, that faded livestock show freebie that had carried the documents that destroyed my nephew's scheme, and walked to the door. Paused there, looked back at Richard one last time. He was staring at the table surface, at the polished wood that reflected his face back at him in distorted miniature, and he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, diminished, a man who'd built his entire life on appearances and credit and the assumption that other people were too stupid to notice. "You could have walked away, Richard," I said quietly. "After the first threat, after I said no the first time, you could have accepted it and moved on. But you kept pushing. You kept escalating. You turned a failed business deal into a criminal conspiracy because you couldn't accept that someone you'd underestimated had the power to say no." He didn't respond, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge that I'd spoken. I left him there in the conference room on the 8th floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his own ambition, and took the elevator back down to the lobby. The security guard took my visitor badge back, wished me a good day, and I walked out into the Houston heat, into the parking lot where my 1987 Chevrolet pickup sat baking in the sun, rust and all, still running, still mine. I drove home on surface streets, windows down because the air conditioning had stopped working in 2011 and I'd never bothered to fix it, and I listened to the engine's familiar rhythm, the slight knock in the third cylinder that I'd been meaning to address for 5 years, and I felt the weight that had been sitting on my chest for 2 weeks start to lift. By the time I pulled into my gravel driveway, parked in the shade of the live oak my grandfather had planted in 1948, the sun was high and brutal and the cicadas were screaming their summer song. I sat in the truck for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, looking at the house that was still mine, that would always be mine, that Richard had tried to take and failed. Then I got out, went inside, and made myself a sandwich, because it was lunchtime and I was hungry and the world kept turning regardless of whose life had just imploded. The bread was white, store brand, a little stale. The cheese was American, individually wrapped. The sandwich was perfect. The bankruptcy filing came through on a Thursday in late July, 4 months after the meeting at Continental Energy, 4 months after Richard's world collapsed in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and witnesses. I learned about it from my sister Caroline, Richard's mother, who called on the landline in the kitchen, her voice tight with the kind of shame that mothers carry when their children fail spectacularly and publicly. She told me Richard had lost everything, the leased BMW repossessed after 3 missed payments, the apartment in the Galleria district emptied and returned to the landlord with 2 months' rent still owed, the watch and the suits and all the expensive props of his performed success sold to pay legal fees that kept mounting like compound interest on a debt that could never be repaid. The Texas Real Estate Commission had suspended his broker's license pending investigation, the word pending doing a lot of work to avoid saying permanently, and the Harris County District Attorney had filed charges, multiple counts, fraud and extortion and attempted elder abuse, each one carrying potential prison time that added up to years Richard didn't have to waste. Caroline wanted to know if I would help him, contribute to his legal defense fund, maybe write a letter to the judge explaining that it was all a misunderstanding, that Richard was a good boy who'd made mistakes under pressure, that family should protect family even when family had tried to destroy family. I told her no, my voice quiet but final, the kind of no that doesn't leave room for negotiation or guilt or the obligation she was trying to invoke. I told her that Richard had threatened me with federal investigations, had attempted to steal my home, had hired workers to empty my life into a dumpster, and that none of that was a mistake or a misunderstanding but a calculated series of choices he'd made while fully aware of what he was doing. I told her that family doesn't weaponize government agencies, doesn't forge legal documents, doesn't bring cameras and notaries and real estate agents to execute a theft in broad daylight. She didn't call back after that, and I didn't expect her to, and the silence that settled over that relationship felt appropriate, clean, the way amputation stops an infection from spreading. I went back to my life, the one I'd been living before Richard decided I was an easy target, the life of a man who owns his land and his time and his peace. The workshop became my territory again, the smell of motor oil and sawdust replacing the memory of expensive cologne and desperation, and I finished the carburetor work on my Chevrolet, the 1987 K10 that had been waiting patiently while I dealt with threats and lawyers and the machinery of retribution. The truck ran smooth after that, smoother than it had in years, the engine turning over with a confidence that came from proper maintenance and attention to detail, and I drove it into town once a week for groceries and hardware supplies and the kind of small errands that fill a retired man's calendar with purpose. The property stayed mine, all 640 acres of it, surface and subsurface, worthless for oil extraction but valuable in ways that don't show up on geological surveys or corporate balance sheets. The land grew wiregrass and mesquite, provided habitat for hawks and coyotes and the occasional wild pig, and required nothing from me except that I not sell it to developers or lease it to frackers or let anyone convince me that empty space was wasted space. Clearwater Mineral Holdings remained what it had always been, a corporate shell protecting what mattered, a legal structure designed to create distance between me and anyone who thought they could pressure an individual but might hesitate before attacking an entity. The registered agent in Delaware forwarded mail once a month, mostly junk, occasionally something official that required a response, and I maintained the annual filings and the business license and all the small bureaucratic rituals that keep a corporation alive and legitimate. In August I hired a painter to fix the exterior of the house, the peeling shutters and the faded siding, not because Richard's real estate agent had photographed the decay but because it was time, because maintenance is how you keep things from falling apart, and I spent 3 days watching a young man named Marcus, no relation to Richard's investor, turn my house from shabby to respectable with primer and paint and attention to detail that reminded me of my own work ethic from 40 years ago. He charged me $1,800, labor and materials, and I paid him in a check that cleared immediately because my finances were exactly what I'd told IRS agent Morrison they were, clean and documented and utterly boring. The garden came back to life in September, tomatoes and peppers and squash growing in raised beds I'd built with my wife back when she was still alive to enjoy the harvest, and I spent early mornings and late evenings watering and weeding and talking to plants that didn't answer but seemed to listen. The tomatoes were good that year, better than they'd been in a while, heavy and red and tasting like summer tasted when I was young, and everything was simpler or seemed simpler in the distortion of memory. I made sauce, canned 12 quarts in ball jars that lined the pantry shelf like small glass soldiers, and I ate fresh tomato sandwiches for lunch more days than was probably nutritionally advisable, but I was 71 years old and if I wanted to eat tomatoes until I was sick of them then that was a choice I'd earned. The legal proceedings against Richard moved with the speed of continental drift, court dates scheduled and postponed and rescheduled, motions filed and countered and argued, the whole machinery of justice grinding forward in increments measured in months and years. I received updates from the district attorney's office, formal letters informing me of status changes and requesting my availability for testimony should the case go to trial, and I kept those letters in a file folder labeled Legal 2026, tucked into the accordion file with all the other documents that chronicled the failed attempt to rob me. Richard's investors, Marcus and Derek, filed a civil suit against him seeking recovery of the $80,000 they'd fronted based on his fraudulent representations, and that case moved even slower than the criminal proceedings, bogged down in discovery and depositions and the complex machinery of contract law. I wasn't party to that suit, had no stake in whether they recovered their money or not, but I hoped they did because they'd been foolish and greedy but not malicious, willing accomplices to Richard's scheme but not architects of it. The IRS investigation that Richard had threatened me with never materialized because there was nothing to investigate, just decades of properly filed returns and legitimate income and the boring financial life of a man who'd worked for a corporation that withheld taxes automatically and had retired with a pension that got reported on a 1099 every January. But the IRS investigation into Richard, the one agent Morrison had opened after I'd sent him documentation of false reports and attempted weaponization of federal resources, that one was ongoing, and Morrison had called me twice for additional information, his questions precise and professional and suggesting that Richard's problems were going to extend well beyond state charges. I slept well during those months, the kind of sleep that comes from having nothing to hide and nothing to fear, no creditors circling, no threats pending, no schemes in progress that required maintenance or acceleration. My conscience was clear in the way that only comes from having been attacked and having defended myself with nothing more than truth and documentation and patience. I hadn't hurt Richard, hadn't sabotaged him, hadn't set traps beyond the ones he'd built himself. I'd simply let him commit his crimes in front of witnesses and then presented the evidence to people whose job was to care about such things. Winter came mild that year, Texas winter being more suggestion than fact, and I spent December rebuilding the fence along the southern property line, replacing posts that had rotted and wire that had rusted, work that was physically demanding enough to make my back ache and my hands blister, but satisfying in the way that manual labor is satisfying when you can see the result of your effort stretched across a landscape. The fence was straight when I finished it, tight and level, a boundary that said this far and no farther, this is mine and that is yours, the kind of statement that property law exists to enforce but that ultimately depends on the willingness of individuals to defend what belongs to them. Caroline called again in January, a year almost to the day after Richard had first driven up my gravel drive with his lawyers and his schemes, and this time her voice carried a different quality, not shame exactly but resignation, the tone of someone who'd accepted that certain outcomes were inevitable and irreversible. She told me Richard had taken a plea deal, admitted to fraud and attempted extortion in exchange for a reduced sentence, 18 months in county jail with possibility of parole after 12, and that he'd be reporting in March to begin serving his time. She didn't ask me to intervene, didn't suggest I write a letter or make a statement or do anything to reduce his sentence, and I appreciated that she'd finally accepted that some situations can't be fixed by family loyalty or maternal advocacy. We talked for 10 minutes about weather and her health and neutral topics that had nothing to do with her son sitting in a courtroom accepting consequences for choices he'd made, and then we said goodbye and hung up, and that was that. I thought about Richard sometimes after that call, thought about him in a cell or a dormitory or whatever county jail housing looked like, wearing clothes that weren't tailored and eating food he hadn't chosen and living in a space where every minute was regulated by people he couldn't impress or manipulate. I thought about whether he understood why it had happened, whether he'd figured out that the problem wasn't bad luck or bad timing but the fundamental miscalculation of assuming that quiet people were weak people, that old people were stupid people, that anyone who presented as less than they were was actually as diminished as they pretended to be. I thought about whether prison would teach him anything or just make him bitter, whether he'd emerge in 12 months or 18 months understanding that competence and intelligence don't always announce themselves, or whether he'd just tell himself a story about how his uncle had been lucky, had fooled everyone, had somehow cheated when really Richard had been the only one playing honestly. I didn't know the answer to those questions and didn't particularly care, because Richard's education or lack thereof wasn't my responsibility anymore, wasn't something I had the power or the obligation to manage. Spring came in March, and with it the wildflowers, bluebonnets, and Indian paintbrush covering the pastures in waves of color that looked like someone had spilled paint across the landscape, and I drove out to the back 41 afternoon just to sit in the truck and watch the wind move through the flowers like water flowing through channels. The land was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with its productivity or its mineral rights or its market value, beautiful because it was space and silence and the kind of emptiness that feels like freedom rather than absence. I thought about my wife, about how she used to drag me out to see the wildflowers every spring, insisting that we take photographs even though the photographs never captured what it felt like to stand in the middle of that color, that abundance, that temporary glory that would be gone in 6 weeks, dried and brown and waiting for next year. She'd been right about a lot of things, my wife, including her prediction that someone would eventually mistake my kindness for weakness and that when it happened they'd learn an expensive lesson. Richard had learned it, was still learning it, would probably be learning it for years in ways that compounded like interest on a debt he couldn't discharge. The lesson was simple, had always been simple, was the kind of thing that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention, that restraint is not inability, that silence is not ignorance, that choosing not to use power doesn't mean you don't possess it. I'd spent 20 years playing a role that protected me from scrutiny and complication, playing it well enough that people believed it, and when Richard had tried to exploit that role he discovered that roles are choices, not realities, and that the men behind the mask had been 10 moves ahead the entire time. I sat in the truck until the sun started dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me of every Texas sunset I'd ever seen, thousands of them stretching back across 7 decades of life in this state, and I felt something close to contentment, close to peace, the sense that the world was ordered correctly, that justice had functioned the way it was supposed to, that threats had been neutralized and boundaries restored and life could continue in the quiet rhythm I'd chosen. I drove back to the house as twilight settled in, the headlights cutting through the gathering dark, and I parked under the live oak and went inside and made myself dinner, chicken and rice and vegetables from the freezer, nothing fancy but hot and filling and mine. The house was quiet except for the sounds I made moving through it, the creak of floorboards and the click of the stove igniter and the rush of water from the tap, and the quiet felt earned, protected, the result of having fought off an invasion and won. I thought about calling Caroline, checking in, maintaining some thread of family connection despite everything that had happened, but I didn't, because some connections aren't worth maintaining, because family is supposed to be about more than shared blood, supposed to include loyalty and respect and the basic understanding that you don't try to rob each other. Richard had violated that understanding, had treated me like an asset to be liquidated rather than a person to be respected, and the consequences that followed weren't my doing but his, weren't revenge but simple cause and effect. The months that followed were unremarkable in the best way, days that blended together in a rhythm of maintenance and routine and the small pleasures that fill a retired man's life when he's not fighting off threats or documenting crimes or preparing for legal battles. I fixed things that broke, replaced things that wore out, maintained the property and the truck and the life I'd built, and I did it all without anyone threatening me or pressuring me or suggesting I didn't know my own mind. The peace was real, tangible, the absence of threat as palpable as the presence of it had been, and I valued it more for having almost lost it, for having seen how quickly someone could try to take it away if they thought you were too weak or too ignorant to defend it. People say you should never mistake kindness for weakness, and it's true, but it's incomplete, because the real lesson is harder and older and goes deeper into human nature than most people want to acknowledge. The real lesson is that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous, not because they're planning violence but because they're observing, calculating, waiting for you to reveal yourself fully before they move. The real lesson is that patience is a weapon more powerful than aggression, that letting someone commit their mistakes completely and publicly is more devastating than stopping them early, that the appearance of weakness can be the most effective camouflage for strength. Richard had learned these lessons the way people learn not to touch hot stoves, through direct contact with consequences that left permanent marks, and I hoped, without much confidence, that he'd remember them, that when he got out of county jail and tried to rebuild whatever life was possible after fraud convictions and bankruptcy and the public humiliation of having been outsmarted by the uncle he'd dismissed as illiterate, he'd remember that appearances deceive and that underestimating people based on their presentation is the fastest way to destroy yourself. I'd been a soldier once, a long time ago in a jungle that had nothing to do with Texas or oil rights or family betrayals, and I'd learned things there about patience and observation and the value of letting enemies commit to courses of action they couldn't retreat from. I'd brought those lessons home, had applied them to a civilian life that mostly didn't require them, had kept them filed away in the same mental space where I kept my other unused skills, the ones you hope you never need but maintain anyway because the world is uncertain and threats emerge from unexpected directions. Richard had been an unexpected threat, family-turned-predator, and dealing with him had required pulling out those old skills, dusting them off, applying them with the same precision I'd once used to survive in places where mistakes were fatal. The skills still worked, turned out, were just as effective at 47 as they'd been at 22, because human nature doesn't change and tactical thinking is tactical thinking regardless of whether you're dealing with enemy combatants or fraudulent nephews. I stood on my front porch one evening in late spring, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and the shadows lengthen across the pasture, and I felt the weight of my 71 years not as burden but as accumulation, the sum total of everything I'd learned and experienced and survived. I'd built a life that was mine, defended it when necessary, and returned to peace on my own terms, and that felt like enough, like the kind of success that doesn't get measured in bank accounts or career achievements but in autonomy and security and the ability to stand on your own land and know that it's yours because you've earned it and protected it and refused to let anyone take it from you. The cicadas started their evening chorus, that rising buzz that signaled the day's end and the night's beginning, and I listened to them the way I'd listened to them every summer of my life, a sound as familiar as my own heartbeat, as permanent as the land itself. Somewhere Richard was in a cell or a common room or wherever county inmates spent their evenings, and somewhere his investors were trying to recover their losses through legal channels that would probably never pay out, and somewhere Continental Energy was pursuing other prospects with better geology and clearer title, and none of it touched me anymore, none of it had power over my peace or my property or my life. I'd won not by attacking but by defending, not by plotting revenge but by documenting reality, not by being smarter than Richard but by being more patient, more thorough, and more willing to let him destroy himself. That was the lesson that would outlast both of us, the one that people kept learning and forgetting and learning again, that you can't cheat someone who knows exactly what you're doing, that you can't steal from someone who's already protected what you're trying to take, and that mistaking strategic patience for genuine weakness is the kind of error that costs everything and teaches nothing except how thoroughly you've misunderstood the situation. I went inside as darkness settled over the property, turned on the lights in the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water from the tap, cold and mineral heavy and tasting like the aquifer 100 feet below the house, like permanence, like something that couldn't be signed away or stolen or diminished by men who didn't understand that ownership isn't just having your name on a deed, but being willing to defend what belongs to you against anyone who threatens it. The water was cold, the house was quiet, the land was mine, and Richard was learning, slowly and expensively, that the hillbilly uncle he'd tried to rob had been a petroleum geologist all along, and that making assumptions based on appearances was the most expensive mistake a person could make.